Hello and welcome to Background Context, a show about the web, web extensions, and the people that build them. My name is Simeon Vincent, and this is Episode 1, February 13th, 2025, WECG Meeting Recap. A couple of days ago, I sat down with Oliver Dunk, a Google Developer Relations engineer working on Chrome extensions, and we caught up on the February 13th meeting of the WebExtensions Community Group. I unfortunately wasn't able to attend, as you'll hear in the episode, but this was a good opportunity to kind of catch up on the conversation and how things are evolving, and also to just nerd out a bit on browser extensions. I just want to say a quick thank you to Google and Mozilla for giving both Oliver and me the time to work on this project. Hopefully we can keep doing it. I was supposed to share the last Web Extension Community Group meeting. I woke up 5 minutes before it ended. So suffice to say, I did not attend. This seemed like a good opportunity to try to do a bit of a WECG meeting recap, talk about what we talked about. For reference, meetings are not publicly recorded. They are public sessions, and we take minutes, but we don't actually record the meeting. So we don't have we don't have a transcript, and we don't have like a detailed recording that people can go catch up on. So my hope is that we can sit down, chat, and share some information about what browsers and the community talked about last week.
That sounds good.
So let's start off. The first thing on the agenda was an announcement of the upcoming WECG meetup in Berlin in March. I know what I was planning to say, and therefore didn't. I'm curious, how did that kickoff go? What was shared there?
Yeah, so I think what you've said is already a lot of what was shared in the meeting. It was just a reminder that we're having an in-person meetup in March, and then a call out for anybody that's an active member of the group that wants to participate to register their interest so that we can get an actual head count of who's looking to attend. And then I don't think there was much discussion beyond that. So it was just a quick heads up and reminder. I'm really looking forward to that. I really enjoy those in-person meetings.
They are pretty great. Hey, yeah, I know that I say this every time we talk about in-person meetups, but I just really enjoy hanging out with this group of folks and sitting down. And I don't know, it's also like a great opportunity to nerd out on a very niche area that you don't necessarily get to very often. The main thing that I wanted to call out in this, so I guess I'm appending it now, the wiki page. We have the Web Extension Community Group has a wiki on our GitHub, and there is a 2025 Berlin F2F coordination. F2F is short for face-to-face. That is the place where I'm planning to consolidate all of the information about logistics and schedule and all of that stuff. And I am in the process right now of kind of lashing together a rough sketch of objectives and goals for the session, so we can start to scaffold out what the individual meetings are going to be. So I'm going to be hopefully sharing some updates on that shortly.
Great. I didn't know that wiki page existed, so that's good to know.
That's also why I added it to the announcement page. So if you go check out the minutes for the 2025-02-13 WECG file, the meeting notes have already been updated on GitHub. Cool. So let's dive into, usually the sessions are divided into kind of a couple of main sections. There's triage, there's timely issues, there's checking on existing issues. People before the sessions will volunteer topics, and then they'll get added to the agenda. By default, when any new issues that are created since our last public meeting will get wrapped up into the agenda as well. So let's, I guess, start off with, it's a pair of issues, issue 755 and 756. The first is proposal about matching, and the second is proposal exclude matching.
I think one thing that we try and do often in the meetings is to get a clear separation between what the specific request is and what the use case is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the use case is really helpful to understand. And then we'll usually start from a point of discussion focused around the proposal and the issue. But sometimes if that proposal doesn't make sense or doesn't seem likely to be something that we'd implement, we might then look at is there something else that we could offer that would solve the same use case? And we'll then go back to the developer or whoever opened the issue and say, we would be supportive of this other thing. Is that something that you'd consider or that would work for you? The reason I call that out is because I think this is a case where we had the initial use case and then we discussed a few different ideas around how to solve that use case. So as best as I understand the use case, and actually I should say here, sometimes the author of the issue is present in the meeting, other times they're not. So if they're not in the meeting, then we do our best to understand the use case from what's in the issue and just sort of using our intuition. This is a case where Erosman wasn't. Is that how you say their name? Do you know?
I say Aerosman, but I don't know.
Okay. Well, Erosman, they weren't present in the meeting, so we did our best job to identify or understand the use case. It might not be quite right, or there may be pieces missing. But the use case was essentially we have the context menus API in extensions where you can register additional context menu items. So if you right click on your browser action, which is the icon your extension has in the toolbar, or on a page, you see some specific options. And they wanted a way to have those options appear if you right clicked on some sort of web-like content. So either an HTTP or HTTPS page, or maybe a blank frame which doesn't have a HTTP URL but is still in a web-like page. But they didn't want that context menu item to appear if you were on a file URL, because the particular action that they were offering to users didn't make sense on a file URL.
Right.
So these were a couple of issues that were talking about how to approach that. Does that sort of make sense as the initial pitch for the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah. And I think the first thing that leaps to mind is Firefox has some additional capabilities related to updating the content of a context menu after it has been displayed. And I don't think I don't think Chrome or Safari support it. It's a Firefox only feature, but it gives developers a imperative way to solve this exact problem. And to some extent, one of the tensions that we're looking at here is imperative versus declarative, that the request is kind of implicitly the ability to better declaratively target, and the current solution, the imperative one, is not widely supported. So I think it is kind of a reasonable question. Like, we could solve this with the imperative API. Is that the direction that we want to pick the platform?
Yeah, and that's actually something that Rob brought up. I'm not too familiar with how that works, but he did mention that it would likely be a solution to some of these issues. I don't know. The way I understood it when it was described was you basically get the ability once the menu is shown to hide certain items. Do you know, are you able to do that before it has its first render? Or will the user see a flash of certain items and then you have the opportunity to hide them?
I haven't tested it myself, so I'm not sure how quick that cycle is. I know a hack that people often use is a mouse over event. So sending a message to the background script on mouse over, and then in response to the mouse over event, adjusting the contents of the menu before it can be shown. And that timing is tight. If the extension's background context isn't alive at the time, it may take too long to start. But if it is alive, then you have a fast enough cycle on desktops that I've seen to be able to dynamically update that content.
Okay, so it sounds like even in Firefox, there might be benefit to having a declarative way of doing this, so you don't have to start the background context if it's non-persistent, and you don't have any of these timing issues that you might run into.
Yeah. I think in general, as we talk about and iterate on capabilities, one of the things on my mind is like, how do we start up less?
Yes. So the proposal in this first issue, 755, was to expand the match pattern syntax that we have in extensions. So extensions have a match pattern syntax, which supports various patterns with wildcards for matching different contexts, usually URLs, and then also a couple of other protocols. And the proposal was to add to the existing patterns we support about new tab and about blank and various other contexts that you might want to match. Because there is already a document URL patterns filter that you can use when you're creating a context menu. So you can already say, I only want the context menu to show if it matches one of these document URL patterns. But the problem is there's no way of including things like blank frames or the new tab page in that pattern because they're not supported by the match syntax.
Right.
So as soon as you add that field, they're never going to show in those contexts. So just adding some additional matching options was the first proposal. I think there was some interest in doing that for contexts that we all share across browsers.
Mhm.
So, for example, I know Timothy, I believe, was supportive of doing that for about blank because we all have the concept of empty frames and about blank. And so that's something that we could potentially all support. About new tab is, I think, only a Firefox feature. I mean, we all have new tab pages, but I don't think any other browser has about new tab as a special URL for that new tab page.
Yeah, I think Chrome internally has it as Chrome New Tab, and that might be aliased to About New Tab. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess we could check.
Actually, yeah,
It looks like it does work.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe there's a justification for supporting it, but I think we felt like doing it that way didn't quite make sense because even if it's a URL which is supported behind the scenes, it doesn't feel like a very sort of browser neutral URL.
Mm.
So then we started talking about other approaches to this. One approach that we were discussing was using something similar to the match origin as fallback field that we have for content scripts. So
Yep.
content scripts are the scripts that you inject into that your extension injects into a web page. And we have something called match origin as fallback, which is a Boolean flag that you can set. And if you set that to true, then as well as checking against the list of URLs you want your script to run in, we'll also say if this is an about blank frame or a blob URL, then we look at what is the origin that's associated with this. So in the case of a blank frame, it would just be the parent frame or the frame that created that frame. In the case of a blob URL, it would be whichever origin created that blob URL. And so that provides us a nice way to match these contexts that we can't match with a URL pattern. And so we could potentially match using that in this case for context menus.
Yeah, that seemed like a potential pattern.
And I think that's where we ended the discussion of this issue. So we came up with that possibility and we wanted to go back and just see, would that work for the reporter? Is that a good approach for this? Issue 756
Mhm.
is very similar. The use case I actually think isn't called out explicitly here, but given that they were opened consecutively by the same author, I'm assuming it's a similar use case.
Mhm.
And this was to have an exclude matches field. And so you could presumably say, if I don't want to run on file URLs, then I just say exclude. And then in my array of patterns to exclude, I have the file scheme with a wildcard. And
Right.
so this is another approach for doing that. It looks like the conclusion we came to was just clarifying the use cases. I think especially given the discussion in the previous issue, it would make sense to see, is it a case of we just need to close one of these issues and then we solve the use case? Or is there a case where we want to do both? I also think the second issue was quite broad, or at least not very specific about the APIs to touch.
Mhm.
So the second suggestion is to add additional matching properties to APIs that don't have them,
Right.
which I think is something we'd all be supportive of, but we really need to discuss on a case by case basis which APIs does it make sense to change and which properties make sense for that specific API.
One of the other complications that leaps to mind with exclude matching as the broad category, match patterns are used in many different places and not always the same way. So,
Yes.
for example, web accessible resources match patterns for the contents that it can be injected into. I believe that includes paths. Is that right? Or
I
it
believe
doesn't
so.
include paths?
Yeah, you're definitely right that there are certain cases where you can and can't have paths. I think content scripts you can have paths unless you're in Chrome and you specify match origin as fallback, in which case we do support paths, but we will only allow the path to be a wildcard.
Hmm. This feels like a case where we could do some distillation of the inconsistencies.
Yes. Host permissions is another case where when you list out the host that you'd like access to, that also uses the match pattern syntax. Uh, and again, in that case, you have to specify a path, but the path is irrelevant. So if you don't specify a path, then we'll show a runtime error saying we can't load this extension. This is invalid syntax. There's no path. But no matter what you set the path to, even if you set the path to example.com / this very specific path or no other path,
Mhm.
we'll treat it as a wildcard. Which, yeah, we should fix.
That could be a little clearer. All right, let's move on to issue 762 DNR, add excluded top frame domains and top frame domains. So that's the excluded version and the not excluded version of this top frame domains concept.
And I actually think we should bundle this one with the next issue. So if you want to introduce that one as well.
Yes, of course. Next issue is 763, proposal, add excluded TopFrameMatches and exclude TopFrameGlobs.
So the use case is similar between these two issues. I think the really important thing to call out is that these are proposals to modify two different APIs.
Mhm.
So issue 762 is about the declarative net request API, which is used for registering declarative filtering rules to say, if the browser makes a request to this URL, I want to block it or redirect it. Whereas issue 763 is about updating the scripting APIs. So adding new fields that you can choose, that you can use to control whether your extension injects scripts on a particular page or not.
So what were the kind of goals of introducing this excluded top frame domains concept?
So this is an interesting case where if you look at it purely in isolation from a technical point of view, it seems sort of weird because generally where you're injecting is, or whether you want to inject is a decision that you make based on the origin of the page and not based on the top frame, which may or may not be related to the frame that is currently being loaded. It
Right.
could be completely different origins, loading completely different content. But the use case, and I think the first issue came from Alexi, who works on Privacy Badger.
Right.
And the second issue came from Polywok. But I think they both speak to the same use case.
Mhm.
And so let me try and explain that. So let's say that you have a social network. So you have example.socialnetwork.com, and then uh, on that social network page, there's a frame which is a game. So this is my examplegame.com.
Mhm.
And as part of that game, it may have some social features. It might want to use the API of the social network to pull some data. And so even though this is a third-party frame that's completely unrelated to the social network, it's still making requests to the social network. And the user might come along and say, I'd actually like to allow these requests. I'd like to allow any time that I'm on this social network. I
Mhm.
don't mind if any of the frames in this frame tree are communicating with that social network because that sort of makes sense. For this entire tab, I'm interacting with that social network and I'm comfortable with it making those requests.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I could see that example being like, I am consciously playing this game and playing it with friends. I want that relationship to be
Yes.
available.
And so one of the solutions that extensions already have today is they'll say, if I'm on a particular site and that site is making requests which are first party to the origin of that site, then you can probably ignore my declarative net request rules. And so we actually have a way of doing that already. There's a domain type condition in the declarative net request API. And so you can say, if the domain type is third party, then apply this rule, which allows you to say, if I'm on example.com and it's making a request to my social network, then that's a third-party request and I don't want it. But we don't have a way of saying, unless the top frame happens to be this URL.
Mm.
And so that's really what these requests are about, is having some way to say, look at the top frame, and if the top frame URL is one of these URLs, then I don't want to apply these rules, or I don't want to inject these scripts which are blocking some other functionality.
Interesting. I think this also feels like it dips into the realm of concerns that developers have highlighted around the more that they have to rely on the platform providing these edge cases and niche capabilities, the slower they are to evolve and iterate on these concepts. Because previously there was no limitation to what they could do in terms of examining content and blocking rules or what was or wasn't permissible and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think this is really a case where it's really good that we have developers using these APIs to tell us about these use cases,
Yeah,
because
definitely.
I think it feels like like I said at the start, it feels like a very weird concept, purely looking at it from a technical perspective in isolation.
Hmm.
But when you hear the use case and the behavior that a user would expect, I think it actually seems completely reasonable, and it's something that makes sense. And so this first issue, 762, we were all supportive of. And so we have the supportive Chrome, Firefox, and Safari labels on that now. And it's something that we could look at implementing in the future.
Very cool.
Then we had issue 763, which, like I said, is the same, but this is, rather than for network requests specifically, this is about when you choose to inject scripts.
Right.
I think there are a couple of concerns here. One that I had was that this is proposing some slightly different ways of matching. So this is proposing exclude top frame matches and exclude top frame globs.
Hmm.
And so the matches is those match patterns that we spoke about. And then globs is an even broader sort of wildcard matching syntax. It's actually quite hard on a technical level to do that, because generally, if you have a frame which is cross origin to the parent frame, then at some point along that path, you lose the path. Like, you know, the origin of the parent frame you're in, but you
Right.
don't necessarily know the full URL of the frame above you. So figuring out what is the full path of the top frame is quite tricky. And without that full path, it doesn't necessarily make sense to support matches or globs.
Mm.
So one of the pieces of follow-up that we wanted was to figure out, is matching against a full match pattern or a glob needed? Or is it enough to simply say, like, exclude top frame origins or domains and match without the path?
Very interesting. Looking forward to hearing more about that
Yeah.
use case and what people have in mind. This also kind of gets into all of the different patterns that are available for matching. Depending on the context, there's globs and match patterns and regular expressions and possibly other syntaxes as well.
And then the other concern, or at least like request that Rob from Firefox's site had, was just to see sort of more evidence that this was something that developers really needed and that developers were already trying to do in other ways. So this is something that you can uh, implement to some extent already. So you can basically always inject the content script, and then in JavaScript, you can actually access the origin of the top frame. So you can have a check which says,
Mhm.
if the origin of the top frame is like matches my origin or is in this list or whatever, then you can return. And so you have a way to basically have an early return in your script, which doesn't prevent you from injecting the script entirely. So
Right.
that's a nice optimization that we could have if we implemented this as a feature that was actually supported in the platform. But it does give developers a way to implement this and show us, like, we're trying to do this. If we had a better way, we would also use that.
Yeah.
And so Rob was quite keen to see that sort of thing.
That is always a complicated issue, especially if a developer is consciously trying to do something so they don't have access. It's it feels wrong from the developer point of view to inject it and then revoke it because you don't even want to inject in the first place.
Yes. Yeah, it's at the very least uh, extra data that has to be sent down to that particular page,
Right.
like a script that has to be loaded and passed that might otherwise not be needed. I mean, maybe the whole script doesn't have to be passed. Browsers are very clever, but if you can avoid asking it to run the script entirely, then that's probably better than asking it to run the script and then it immediately returns on the first line.
Unfortunately, I think it does have to be parsed. The entire thing has to be, yeah, you need to parse the script before you can begin execution, and you can't do that. There isn't something at the parsing stage that would enable you to bail, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, I just don't know. Can you pass? Maybe you can pass line by line and like execute the first line and then bail. But yeah, definitely outside of my level of understanding of the JavaScript engines that the various browsers have.
Cool. So next up, I think we have PR 760, specification for loading extensions in WebDriver Classic. I believe Chiara has been driving this work on the Apple team.
Yeah, so I don't think there's too much to say here. Um, we have been working on adding support for loading extensions to WebDriver BiDi, which is the new communication protocol for tests in browsers. Um, we have that specification that landed a while back, or at least a few weeks ago, probably longer at this point. Uh, for Safari, they're planning to implement this initially in WebDriver Classic, which is the previous version of the communication protocol.
Mhm.
And so this was just adding some notes on how they're planning to implement that, and sort of making the links between this thing that we're implementing in WebDriver Classic is based on this step of the algorithm in WebDriver BiDi. And
Yeah.
yeah, we briefly discussed this. I've already approved it. I think generally everyone's happy. So hopefully this will. Oh, it has merged actually. So I was going to say hopefully this will be merged soon, but looking at the PR, it has already merged.
Honestly, I'm really excited about that work because it's also going to enable developers to do more testing of extensions. Um, this is a mutually beneficial area where us scratching our own needs as browsers and as people working on trying to make behavior more consistent also helps developers better test and experiment with and verify the behavior of their own extensions.
Yeah, for sure. I've written quite a few tests for extensions in the past. Actually, I gave a talk in the past around sort of how to test a browser extension and what you can and can't do. But previously, I think what we've had has been very limited. You've been able to use the same frameworks that you can use to test the web, and that's gotten you so far. But as soon as you want to do something which is extension specific, where you want to open the pop up or run some code in the service worker, it starts to get a lot harder.
Yeah.
So, yeah, building out all of this infrastructure to be able to fully test extensions, I think is going to allow us in the community group to write some cross browser tests that basically make sure we have consistent implementations and implementations that are following the specification that we'll hopefully have eventually. And then, like you say, for developers, it hopefully means that the platform supports all of these things so that they can then be easier to call in Selenium or Puppeteer or whatever tool you're using to write your tests.
Fingers crossed. Looking forward to it. So on speaking of WebDriver, our next issue 764 is WebDriver install command optional parameters. What's going on with this one?
Yeah, so this is basically just a call to start discussion. So Christoph has been working on. He worked on the initial WebDriver BiDi specification for how to load extensions. So, like I was saying, this is the precursor to the PR we just discussed from Chiara. And so he's looking at what the next steps are. And one of the things was, are there various features that we want to support? So, for example, uh, I think Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, we all support running extensions in incognito.
Mhm.
And so, do we want to have a way of controlling that, allow in incognito setting for an extension when we're loading an extension in a test? And then there are various other settings. Firefox has a way to install temporarily. There's pinning an extension to the toolbar. There are all these things that you may want to support. And so this is just starting some discussion around what those things should be, what should we support, what shouldn't we support. And we didn't actually get into the discussion too much in the meeting, rather just calling out that this issue existed and that we wanted everyone to leave their thoughts.
Yeah, Christoph from the Ghost Ray team has been championing this WebDriver expansion of capabilities, and like he's been working on the implementation and doing great work. So my hat's off to him.
Yeah, no, exactly. Same from me. I think it's been really nice because we were starting to look at working on tests mostly from the perspective of how do we build these cross-browser web platform tests.
Yeah.
And then he came in looking at this from the perspective of actually how do we support testing more from a developer perspective, wanting to write tests for their own extension. And it just turns out that we both have our own reasons for wanting this work. I mean, I think we both also appreciate the other reason. It's not like we have these two completely separate reasons and we have no interest in the other reason for doing this work. But it's just sort of it's all aligned where lots of people are excited about this, and Christoph in particular has been just going above and beyond with opening PRs and then working for a lot of feedback to get those landed. I know, like as soon as you write anything that has sort of specification text, you get a lot of feedback, and so I really appreciate him working through all of that and getting to the point where we actually have something which has landed now, and hopefully browsers will be implementing soon.
That's the old adage, the easiest way to find the correct answer is to share the wrong one.
Yes.
And last up, issue 746, proposal of persistent authentication. I think this was a late add. Did anything end up happening with this issue?
I think this was on the agenda from the start of the meeting, but unfortunately we didn't get to it, so we didn't have any discussion.
It wasn't on the agenda that I prepared.
Okay, maybe not then.
No. I think it was like it was suggested in the time shortly before the meeting.
Okay,
so
yeah.
I think it was from the start of the meeting to the end on it. It just, yeah.
One thing I do really appreciate is we have been getting a lot better over time, having more of the agenda prepared before the meeting.
Yeah.
So this week actually was a really nice case where I felt like more than ever before, I was able to take a look at the issues before the meeting. I had some conversations on the Chrome side with various members of the team to see, is there something we'd be interested in? Do we have any thoughts that we should share in the meeting so we can get some immediate feedback? And I think that just, it helps us get it helps us sort of give our support or any further questions on the issue as soon as possible, which keeps things moving.
Yeah. One of the other things that we do to try to help organize and collect this information is we create a agenda issue in an issue on our GitHub repo with the agenda tag, and there should only be one of those open at a time. That will be the next meeting's agenda, and people can make suggestions about what they'd like to see added. I want to get better about multiple times over the lead up to a meeting, updating the placeholder agenda with content as people propose it, as it evolves. Usually I try to do it minimum 12 hours before.
Yeah.
But I would like to extend that further.
But I think even with the way it's been working up to now, I think that works. It's easy enough to skim through the comments on the agenda issue and see what's going to be discussed. Of course, keeping the summary at the top open or up to date is also nice, because sometimes there might be some discussion in the thread and then you don't have to read through that to see what the actual end result is.
Right.
But I think it's workable. We haven't had too much discussion up to now.
That's the audio sting you get to say we're done with the episode. So that's it. It was a pleasure talking with Oliver. Hopefully we're going to do another one of these soon. We just had the February 27th meeting of the WebExtensions Community Group, so there should be another episode coming out in the not too distant future. Don't know when Turns out audio editing is hard. We'll figure it out. The show is online at backgroundcontext.com. Thanks for listening, and see you on the internet. As a kind of final bit, you get me making noises. Oh. Whoa. I don't know what that was. Well, you're listening to it. So that's the end. Bye.